You got to make some sort of decision. We're in the process of laying out our entire adult program, so down the road we'll be studying the minor prophets again, and so it's not really all that vital that we get that. So I thought, what do we need to know? Well, why do we have so much problem with the minor prophets? I believe that's part of it. We've read the minor prophets. We read several verses from Amos last week, and they were understandable. I mean, there's not, when you read the minor prophets, the words make sense. I mean, you read a paragraph, and it's not like reading other things in the Bible. They just make sense. And there are difficult sections, obviously, in the minor prophets, but the words make sense. And so you read 2 or 3 verses, and it's not like the writings of Paul where there's a 7-verse, one sentence that goes for 7 verses. Once you get the concept of the graphic nature of the words of the prophets, they make sense. Here's our problem. We do not know the historical setting of the minor prophets. And that's why every time, and likely every time until we finish this study, we're going to begin our Sunday morning class by talking about what happened when Solomon died. Now, I want you to give a better answer than little Tommy did. We were in New Zealand, and Ron Coleman had a nephew named Tommy. And he says, Tommy said, you know what happens when somebody dies? See what concept this child had. And the little boy said, yes. And so Ron said, well, what happens when somebody dies? He says, you call the cops. So what happened when Solomon died is, I don't want that kind of an answer. Does anybody, in your wildest imagination, can anybody guess within 300 years of what year it was that Solomon died? I said guess, I mean, What'd you say, Dave? You can come back after school. You and I will have his detention. He died at the end of his reign, is what Dave said. Okay, try to get it. Try to get this. It's the year's 931, but if you can get about 900. I'm trying to round it off to make you so you can get a handle on it. I really believe you ought to get 931. It's a nail me down date like 1492, but it was 931 BC when Solomon dies. Now, when he dies, the kingdom, it is divided into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And I love asking this question: which of those two kingdoms was the best kingdom? The South. Okay, I mean, just smile whenever you say it. I know if you're from Michigan or some other place like that, maybe a little bit hard to say the South. How much better was it? Well, just about that much. How many kings did the Southern Kingdom have? 19. How many kings did the Northern Kingdom have? 19. In the Southern Kingdom, how many good kings were there? 4. In the Northern Kingdom, how many good kings were there? 0. Have you got that written down, Mike? Or have you got it in your head? You were saying it out loud. I mean, with so much confidence, I thought Jean was whispering the answers in your ear. So she tried to. Okay, can't hear. So you've got the two kingdoms. Now, we've done this thus far by dividing this group over here, since you guys are on the south side of the building, to ask you, those on the south side of the building, what is the name of the southern kingdom? What name does it have? Judah. The name of the northern kingdom? Israel. So you've got Israel and you've got Judah. Israel's in the north and Judah's in the south. You know how I remember things in the crooked way inside my head? I couldn't keep that separated. I honestly could not figure out which one was north and which one was south. So I thought of your eyes and your jaws. I and J. Now I know that you spell eyes with an E, but but if you just say it out loud, it sounds like you're spelling it with an I. So you've got your I's in the north, that's Israel, and you got the J's in the south, that's Judah. And I remember somebody saying, Dan, you confuse me every time you say this to me. And I said, well, I sure love my way of remembering it better than your way of forgetting it. And I really mean that. If that is of any help to you, if you've got one of those minds that just sticks it in there and you've got it forever, wonderful. But you didn't do too well with 931 trying to put that up there inside your heads. Southern kingdom, Judah, in the south, 4 good kings. Northern kingdom, well, no good kings, and so God brings judgment against both of these kingdoms. You've got Israel, and you've got Judah. You've got Israel, and you've got Judah, and so you've got that problem. It bothered me that I just put Judah on the left. I'm sorry. That's why if you saw my consternation in my head, I couldn't get Judah on the Lord's left hand, because you're the good guys over here. What happens to those kingdoms? They are destroyed. The northern kingdom lasted 200 years. The southern kingdom lasted 300 years. And then there's captivity. What happened to the northern kingdom was Assyria, Nineveh, the capital city, came down and destroyed the northern tribes, all 10 of them, and scattered them all over the world. That's why you hear about the 10 lost tribes. The Bible specifically tells us where they went. They're the 10 lost tribes in the sense that they lost their identity. And it's only in that sense. I find it remarkable that there are those individuals who have set up religious organizations telling people that they were the 10 lost tribes. The Mormons told the Polynesian people in the South Pacific that you're part of the scattered 10 lost tribes. There was a guy on the radio many years ago, Herbert W. Armstrong, Radio Worldwide Church of God, and the 10 lost tribes were the 10 lost tribes it was America and England to just sort of push it down. That's where they were. And of course, he also figured out where the tribe of Dan went. Can you use your imagination to think where in Europe the tribe of Dan might have gone? Yeah, Denmark, among the Danish people. And those are the argumentation. In fact, Armstrong says that the descendants of Ephraim is where the British people came from. And one argument he made was, can you not hear or see the similarity between the word Ephraim and Britain? And I read that sentence and I thought, I don't think so. I must have reread it. And I went and read it again, and no way. No way. All right, let's get back to the book of Amos now. And where we were last week is we were introducing the fact and that God is concerned about the nations. In the book of Amos, God is concerned about the nations that are around the Jewish nations. It's wrong, and we have a wrong concept if we think that, well, whenever God selected the Jews to be His chosen people, He just totally forgot about those nations. That's as wrong as it could be. The first 39 chapters of the book of Isaiah concern the Gentile nations, by and large. Not every chapter, obviously, but those early books concern, the Gentile nations there. And there are prophecies about Babylon, long prophecies about the destiny of Babylon, Tyre and Sidon, especially Tyre, long discussions about those. And so when you read the book of Amos, you read those first 2 chapters, and what you're getting is God's message through Amos to those nations that surround them. When you get down to chapter 2, chapter 2 talks about the judgment there was on Judah. I don't know what Bible you've got, and I'm trying to use the Pew Bible. It's on page 809, if that'll help you find the book of Amos. But there are headings in this Pew Bible, and when you get to chapter 2, look at the heading right before verse 4 at the top of the page, Judgment on Judah. And before verse 6, Judgment on Israel. And so God has a message for all of these nations that surround the Jews. So now he says, starting in chapter 3, let's get to chapter 3. Hear this word the Lord has spoken against you, O children of Israel, against the whole family who I brought from the land of Egypt. That's interesting. What's the name of that northern kingdom? Israel. What's the name of the southern kingdom? Judah. But sometimes the word Israel is used for both kingdoms. And so chapter 3 says, wait a minute, I've got a message for the whole household of the children of Israel. Who's Israel? When you hear that, I think it's going to be helpful if you'll think Jacob. God changed Jacob's name from Jacob to Israel. And I really wish when I'd been in Sunday school, when people talked about the children of Israel were led by Moses out of the land of Israel. I made no association at all with that being the children of Jacob. That's just like saying the Amorites or the Canaanites. Who are these folks? Well, they're the Jewish folks. But what you're saying is that Moses led Jacob's children out of the land of Egypt. And if you're teaching your children or teaching your grandchildren, you'd really be wise if you'll put this in their head, provided you can get it in your own head, okay? And that is that the Israelites are Jacobites. And so when you read about the Israelites, you're talking about the descendants of Jacob. In Israel now, there's the Jewish people who are there. The Israelis, if you'll think about them being Jacobis, and I know there's probably not any such word as that, but that's who we're talking about. It is a nation. And so he says in chapter 3, I have a message for the whole family that I brought up from the land of Egypt. You only have I known of all the families of the earth, therefore I will punish you for all of your iniquities. You want a verse that really jumps out and says God's chosen people? Of all the nations of people on this earth, the Lord said, I've only known you. In the book of Romans, chapter 3, what advantage then has a Jew? In the book of Romans, he's saying, the Gentiles have sinned, the Jews have sinned. What advantage then is there to being a Jew? And the answer in chapter 3, verse 1, verse 2, is much in every way, chiefly because unto them God gave His oracles. He gave the commandments to them. What advantage is there to being a Jew? Well, you know the name of Jehovah. You know what God did with your forefathers. You know about Enoch walking with God. You know the judgment of God in the days of Noah. You know of the God selecting Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And you have a tremendous advantage over every Gentile. And so whenever he says, you only have I chosen of all the people on this earth, in one of the minor prophets, he talks about the fact that God had led the Philistines. Listen to this. Did I not lead the Philistines out of Kir, K-I-R? We don't even know where that happened. We know of God leading the Israelites out of the land of Egypt and the miraculous way in which He did it. But God said, this Philistine nation, they were not, that's not their heritage. I led the Philistines out of Kir. And He mentions the Syrians also in another place, that I led the Syrians out of this place. God was concerned about the nations and so very much aware of that. But He says, You're the only ones I have known. So God was in their midst. If you talked about the manifestation of God at the tabernacle, you talk about the manifestation of God at Mount Sinai, the manifestation of God on the Day of Atonement, whenever He met the Jews there in that most holy place. I have chosen you. And then look at the message. Can two walk together except they agree? We are about ready in the book of Amos for God, speaking through Amos, to turn the heat on Israel and relentlessly discuss the things that are happening and the ungodliness that is there. And so he says, here's a lion that roars in the forest. Does he make any noise when he has no prey? No. You know, he only roars whenever there is a prey, when there is something from that. Was it in this passage that where we read the Lord roars out of Israel? We've read that passage recently in some class that I was teaching, and what it would be like when God roars. Well, here's a lion that roars. Why? Because I am ready to attack. Will a lion roar if it doesn't have any prey? If you look at a charging lion coming after its prey, then take that same figure and bring it over to God. God is ready. Will a young lion cry out in the forest when he has no prey, or cry out of his den when he's caught nothing? Will a bird fall into a snare on the earth when there's no trap for it? And then he says, verse 6, if a trumpet is blown in a city, will not the people be afraid? If there's calamity in a city, will not the Lord have done it? Surely the Lord does nothing unless He reveals His secret to His servants the prophet. A lion roars. Who will not fear? The Lord has spoken. Who can but prophesy? That's powerful. Amos, why are you from the southern kingdom? Why on earth are you up there in such a hostile environment? Why are you there? Because the Lord has spoken. Jeremiah said, a prophet, I decided I wasn't going to say anything. People were not receptive. I was just going to shut my mouth. And so Jeremiah said, this is too much for me. I've decided I will say nothing. You know what the imagery Jeremiah uses after he discusses that? His word was like a hot, burning coal of fire inside my bosom. Now, you just imagine the imagery that's there. That's why I love the Minor Prophets. It is graphic. You know, Lawrence, if you got a, not hot gravy, but if you got the whole meatball down inside, you understand what I mean? Oh, man. And Jeremiah says, that burning coal was there, and I could not remain silent. I had to speak. And sometimes it bothers me tremendously to think of how many opportunities God lays before us. And we fail to speak. Josh and I are going to be teaching on Wednesday night, starting in November, a class about personal work. And one of the things we want to talk about is how do you start religious conversations? How do you get from this, I just don't know how to say, I just don't know how to get from this point over to that point. And I know sometimes that's difficult because we're afraid we'll say the wrong thing. Well, I want to tell you this. If your neighbor's house was on fire, and it's 1:30 in the morning, and the neighbor's house is on fire, are you going to really worry about how much you articulate? Are you really concerned about the fact, well, I just might say something wrong? What are you going to do? The man that's on death row, waiting for the phone call to come from the governor that says he's gotten a reprieve, he's not going to be executed at midnight tonight. He's not overly concerned about the educational attainment of the man who answers the phone when he delivers the message from the governor. And so Amos says, look, God is not going to do anything except He reveals it through His prophet. I'm a prophet of God, and therefore, here's God's judgment. And so he says, and this is real interesting, we get to verse 9, proclaim in the palaces of Ashdod. Ring a bell? Philistine city. Go over in the language of in the palaces of Ashdod, and go down to the land of Egypt, and say to them, assemble on the mountains and see what's happening in the midst of this city, and how the oppressed within her. They do not know to do right, says the Lord, who store up violence and robbery in their palaces. Therefore, thus says the Lord, an adversary shall be all around the land. He shall sap your strength from you, and your palaces shall be plundered. God's ready to move. God's ready to bring judgment. Look in verse 14. That in that day I will punish Israel for their transgression. I will visit destruction on the altars of Bethel, and the horns of the altar shall be cut off and fall to the ground. I'll destroy the winter house along with the summer house. The houses of ivory shall perish, and the great houses shall have an end. Judgment's coming. So he says, Bethel, when Solomon dies, the first king of the northern kingdom, named Rehoboam, says, if the people of that northern kingdom go back to Jerusalem to worship, it will not be long before they will leave me as king and go back and become a part of the Jewish nation. It's amazing how he did that. He set up a Jewish denomination. And that's about what he did. He figured it out, and he said to the people in the northern kingdom, it's too difficult for you to go down there to Jerusalem. We will set up some worship places here. One, Dan, up in the north. The other is Bethel. Guess where Bethel is? It's on the interstate highway that goes from Samaria down to Jerusalem. I hope you understand I'm speaking facetiously. On the main road, as you in the northern kingdom might be headed down to Jerusalem to worship, and when you get to Bethel, there's a place you can worship. And he ordained feasts just like the feast you've got down there in the southern kingdom. Now, he's got a problem, that is you don't have any Levites to make priests, and so he appointed men to be priests who are not of the tribe of Levi, but what difference does that make? And that's so when he begins to talk about Bethel, he says that's what's going to happen. Now then, he says, I will visit and destroy Bethel, and the horns of the altar shall be cut off and fall to the ground. And your winter houses, which evidently is the house where the king might have lived, and the houses of ivory. How much ivory you have in your house? Can you imagine the luxurious nature of the way things were? He says they're coming to an end. Chapter 4, verse 1 talks about those individuals who were there who oppress the poor, crush the needy, ungodly. Let's go over to chapter 6 and look at some ivory over in chapter 6. Amos chapter 6. The Lord says, all of that ivory up there and that winter house that you've got, the vacation home that you've got, or, it's rather funny when you think of winter houses. Folks up north think about Florida. You know where folks in Florida go, for their second house? They go up north. Not necessarily in the winter, but the mountain cabins and things we have up in the Carolinas, because it gets too hot here. We're doing the same thing northerners do, just doing it in the reverse kind of situation. Now look at chapter 6. Woe to you who are at ease in Zion and trust in Mount Samaria. Notable people in the chief nations to whom the Lord comes, go over to Calneh and see from there. How am I not in the verse that I want to be? Yes, verse 3. That's where I wanted to get. Woe to you who put off the day of doom, who cause the seat of violence to come near, who lie on beds of ivory. You got a picture of that? How much would a bed of ivory be worth? Listen, how unique is ivory? That's why it's so expensive. And so here are people in that northern kingdom, and they have beds of ivory. You know, that's more than press wood. And so he says, you've got beds of ivory. You stretch out on your couches. You eat lambs out of the flock and calves from the midst of the stall. You're talking about breakfast in bed. They've got absolutely everything. Lying up there in their ease and in their comfort, who sing idly to the sound of stringed instruments and invent for yourself musical instruments like David. You drink wine from your bowls and anoint yourself with the best ointments. And then he says, but you are not grieved for the affliction of Joseph. Is it wrong to have a bed of ivory? Is it wrong to have breakfast in bed? Is it wrong to wear perfume? Is it wrong to invent instruments of music like David did? Absolutely not. What's wrong is not grieving for the sins in Egypt. See, Elijah, and we talked about this last week, the contest at Mount Carmel where Elijah killed the 400 prophets of Baal, immediately after that, Elijah leaves the northern kingdom and heads down, actually gets down as far as Mount Sinai. It's really amazing how far he travels. And he says to God, go ahead and take my life. There's not one righteous person in that northern kingdom other than myself. You ever feel that sometimes about America, how far it's getting away from God? Elijah did not know a single person other than himself who believed in God. That's amazing. I don't know anybody. So Lord, just go ahead and take my life. You remember God's answer to Elijah was, Elijah, there are 7,000 people in that northern kingdom. But whenever God looks at this time at Amos, at Israel, and he says, they're not grieving for Israel. There's more righteous folks in America than we think. It's very likely, is it not, that the reason that America hasn't fallen under the judgment of God is tied in many respects to the reason that Abraham argued with God about the salvation of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham says to God, will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? Will not, and then he says, God, you're going to do what's right, aren't you? Will not the judge of all the earth do right? You cannot come and bring the judgment, the fiery judgment of God on Sodom, because there are righteous people in that city. And if there are righteous people, How can you do that? Why wasn't Noah killed in the flood? There's a judgment of God. Why? Has to do with the nature of God, doesn't it? When God's judgment came against the city of Jerusalem, He gave inside information to the Christians. When you see Jerusalem encompassed about with armies, do what? Flee to the mountains. The desolation of it is near. God could not bring judgment against the Christians in that city. Get out. He can no more do that than He could throw you into hell. You get it when I say it that way, right? You've lived your life, served Him faithfully, and now on Judgment Day He's going to throw you in. No. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And so Abraham says, what number does he start with? If there are how many righteous people in Sodom, what number does he start with? 50. And he says, well, what if there's not quite 50? What's his second number? 45. What about 40? And I've made it all the way from 50 down to 40. So he says, I took baby steps between 50 to 45. What about 30? What about 20? What about 10? Do you know why he stopped at 10? Why did you stop at 10? 10 is not God's number. God's number is 1. Abraham, who later is called the friend of God, did not understand that much about God. That's remarkable, isn't it? This is sort of early in the life of Abraham when he's walking up the mountain ready to offer Isaac. He says God will provide for Himself the sacrifice. He doesn't really know his friend. But when those numbers are coming down, 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10, why does he stop at 10? Lord, can you destroy 5 righteous people in that city? There were 4. There's Lot and Lot's wife and the 2 daughters. And because it violates the nature of God to destroy the righteous with the wicked. And by the way, Peter calls Lot righteous Lot, whose soul was vexed when he saw the immorality in Sodom. And so God sends the messengers, and they have to physically take hold, not just of the, Lot's wife and the daughters. They have to physically put their hands on Lot and pull Lot out of that city. Why? It's the nature of God. And that ought to help you. That ought to help you understand something about the nature of God. But the worst thing you can do is to not grieve about sin. Why has America arrived at the place where it is? Because it's not grieving about sin. Romans chapter 1 talks about when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful. And whenever you get to the end of a catalog of probably 20 or 25 sins enumerated by name, he says that these, knowing the judgment of God is against these things, not only do such things, but take pleasure in those who do them. What was the last good movie you saw? What's America entertained by? Think about the content of the programs that are on television and the immorality that is there. Amos, they're not grieved about sin. Romans chapter 1, they enjoy watching sin. Not a whole lot of difference, is there? In Romans chapter 1 and America chapter 240 years, however old this nation is. Isn't that amazing? And so the Lord says His judgment is coming. He says, I don't know where to go next. Look in chapter 7, verse 7. Amos said, then he showed me the Lord stood on a wall made with a plumb line in his hands. And the Lord said to me, Amos, what do you see? And he says, I see a plumb line. Behold, I'm setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will not pass them by anymore. When was the last time you saw a plumb line? I was hoping Dirk would be here. Dirk's up at Seoul with those 50 folks that are up there at Seoul this weekend. You know what a plumb line is? Talk about it, Gary. Yeah. You know the simplest way to make sure that column is straight? Just take a string, put a rock down on the bottom. Tie that string up here to the ceiling, and just let that plumb line, let it be pulled down straight, and you can stand here and you know the plumb line is straight. And all you do is look at the plumb line and then look at the column to see which one's out of line. That's what the Lord said. God said, I put a plumb line on Israel. Guess what? I have set a plumb line on Israel and the wall and it's crooked. What's God's plumb line for us? Right here. On the day of judgment, the books were open and they will be judged by the things that are written in the books. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, and in your name done many wonderful works? And the Lord said, I never knew you, because not everyone that says, Lord, Lord, is going to enter the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father in heaven. And you put, that's Matthew 7:21-23. Put Luke 6:46. Why do you call me Lord and don't listen to what I say? Here's the plumb line of righteousness. I've prophesied in His name, cast out demons in His name, and in His name I've done many wonderful works. That's my plumb line of my righteousness. That's not the plumb line. You can think you're righteous because in your eyes it looks rather straight, but He says, it's not the one who says, Lord, and boasts about what he's done. It's the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. And there's this plumb line right here. Lord, Lord, that's mockery. Why do you call me Lord? And I love the New King James above the Old King James whenever he says, depart from me, ye workers of iniquity. Do you know what the Greek is? And it's in the New King James. You who work lawlessness. Every time you read the word iniquity in the New Testament, think lawless. Think about the ungodliness there is in Washington. The ungodliness there is, the lawlessness there is in business. The lawlessness there is in dealing with college football players who do wrong. And the lawlessness there is whenever your children say, I'm going to do what I want to do. That's remarkable, isn't it? I don't know. We may spend one more time in Amos. I love it. I mean, I wish we could look at every verse. Maybe on a Monday night study we could get in here and spend some time looking. There is a verse that we've got to deal with in chapter 9 where the Lord says, I'm going to restore the house of David, put David back on the throne, which premillennialists use to talk about the fact that in the rapture, or in the millennium, Jesus is going to come back and be set on the throne in Jerusalem. Misuse of the verse. Probably I'll spend some time, just a few minutes, looking at that. That's it for today. Go ahead and ring that second bell if you